If you caught the last few videos in the Resident Evil Retrospective, you're likely aware that the development process for these games are often cursed with issues, and Resident Evil 3 wasn't about to break with such a long-held tradition. During development, RE3 was actually supposed to be exclusive to Sega's last entry in the console market, the Dreamcast. Now there tends to be a lot of contention in the community when it comes to this Dreamcast entry being the true successor to RE2. Depending on where you look, there's an abundant amount of info that points to the Dreamcast as being the home of this numbered entry in the RE universe, but there are still skeptics that see things differently. In the spirit of converting some of you with a bit of often overlooked info and giving some love to a similarly overlooked RE game, let's dive into what might be the most contested entry in this long-running franchise in Part 3.5 of the Resident Evil Retrospective. Alright, so before we jump into this bad boy, we have to deal with a pretty big misunderstanding. It seems that there is a sizable group out there that questions the validity of Code Veronica's symbolic place as an official entry, so let's clear that up with a bit of logic. Thanks to Nemesis writer Yasuhisa Kawamura, we know that the current RE3 started its life as a spin-off with a brand new protagonist. The only conflict occurs with an interview that Shinji Mikami gave to IGN, stating that the numbered entries were always supposed to stay on the PlayStation and all other consoles would get subtitled entries. Not only does this directly contradict the stories from members of both teams, but it also means that Capcom wanted a numbered entry of their flagship series to star a previously unknown character, and that a Dreamcast spin-off should star the main character of the last official release. Now I don't know about you, but in the face of all the information stating otherwise, counting on Capcom to make a creatively and financially risky move like this is evidence of some pretty big leaps of faith. So from now on, we're going to continue as if Code Veronica was meant to be the third entry in the series, because it was.
What was that all about?
Code Veronica is the story of Claire Redfield and her continuing search for her brother and fellow main character Chris. This sisterly quest leads her through a network of Umbrella intrigue and eventually to their base of operations in Paris. Since this occurs 3 months after the events of Part 2 and 3, Umbrella is already in high alert and apparently well aware of Claire's infiltration. After an admittedly cool action sequence, Claire is captured and sent to an Umbrella prison colony/research facility on Rockford Island. Almost as soon as she shows up, a rival paramilitary unit proceeds to invade and causes the release of our beloved T-Virus. And this is where Code Veronica trails off from the established norm. In any other RE game, the goal of escaping a virus-infected hellhole would be the whole of the motivation, but in this game, we actually get to see what happens after a successful escape. Well, maybe successful is the wrong word.
My apologies, but I cannot let you escape now.
Joining us in our escapades is a shoo-in for the most annoying sidekick in the series award, the offensively Canadian Steve Burnside.
Wait a second, what just happened?
Steve is annoyingly written and even more annoyingly voiced, and come to think of it, pretty much the entire voice cast is a huge step backwards from the huge improvements found in Parts 2 and 3. I'm assuming this has something to do with resources being drafted into RE3's development, but honestly, who knows? As far as story is concerned, this is a pretty nice entry in the overall RE mythos. The changes in the formula by having multiple settings and the retreading of previous locations with Chris showing up for a late rescue is actually pretty damn cool and a welcome refreshment. Of course, there are obvious flaws like the fact that Claire traveled all the way to Paris on a hunch, searching for her brother, but then just emails him through Leon.
I've got to contact Leon and tell him to let my brother know he's being monitored.
But if you spend too much time scratching your head and wondering why she didn't just email him before all this, thereby getting rid of her need to be caught in the French offices of a pharmaceutical company, you'll be too busy to notice the pure refinement of the Resident Evil gameplay system. Yes, Code Veronica is probably the purest and most modern example of classic Resident Evil mechanics. Tank controls have made a triumphant return, and they are still an absolute joy to master, but now they move you around in fully 3D environments. Now, I know what you're thinking, and no, this isn't some type of crazy revisionist history nonsense, These are indeed 3D environments in an RE game. For those of you whose minds may be currently blown, don't worry, the camera remains locked in those familiar cinematic positions we've all grown to know and love, at least as long as I'm the one making the videos around here. With the fully rendered background comes some sweeping and panning action with the cameras, which is now my preferred type of camera system for survival horror games. I'm not sure why, but your traditional fixed perspectives mixed with some limited camera movements makes this the most horror movie feeling game in the series, at least for its time. To be honest, I think this system would have been the series baseline if not for the changes to come, but we'll cover that more in depth in the next entry. Combat is exactly what fans of Resident Evil have come to expect from the series, but with a few tweaks here and there. Don't worry though, holding R1 still aims and the action button still fires. The exploding gas cans from 3 have made an appearance, and there's a new emphasis on holding some weapons in both hands, which leads to targeting 2 enemies at once. Both of these mechanics are kinda cool to have around, but ultimately aren't too important overall. That's not to say that they're useless, they just won't be replacing your go-to strategies anytime soon. Towards the end of the game, there's the inclusion of a robot enemy that scans the area you're in and calls a hunter if it catches you, but these are too sparse to really call huge changes. They did spruce things up a little bit, which is nice. And since we're on the subject, this game feels like the lightest offering so far when enemy variety is concerned. The only new additions are these Bandersnatches, and they look about as lame as they sound, with just a couple of bonus points for being able to use their long arms to follow you through some areas. Oddly enough, the real variety to be found is with the zombies. It's pretty clear that there was a real passion at Capcom to make zombies dangerous again. At first, the only thing you'll notice is their tendency to fall forward when they're close to dying. This changes the usual RE strategies and had me keeping my distance more than any of the previous games. On top of this, there's also Parasite Zombies in the last quarter of the game who will shoot out the gross creatures growing inside of them. Add this to some zombies being strapped with explosives and their new ability to climb stairs, and you've got yourself one damn versatile foe. And I obviously appreciate the large variety of unique corpses you come across. The addition of some simple things like hats and helmets flying off the recently deceased, and them realistically sliding down walls and falling down stairs, goes a long way in CV's obsession with adding things that only series veterans will love. Backtracking through creepy environments is still required for progression, and other than a drawn-out bit in the beginning, still feels like that quality RE experience. The ridiculously contrived puzzles are back and might even be at peak levels of contrived ridiculousness. All things considered, this is the total package gameplay-wise. The locations are spooky and inviting enough to keep you wanting to explore them, and the backtracking sessions, broken up by classic survival horror combat that we're all used to, might be at its best in the series, which makes sense because this was also the longest Resident Evil game of its time, clocking in at a whopping 12 or so hours. Graphically, Code Veronica is damn impressive, but that's sort of expected as this is the first entry on such a powerful platform. The Dreamcast has always had a few recognizable quirks with its 3D, but CV may be the best looking game on the console. The addition of relatively dynamic lighting makes some areas look absolutely amazing, and it also supports 480p if you have a good VGA or SCART box. Items in your menu have regained the 3D models they used to have in the first Resident Evil, and character models are pretty damn smooth all things considered. The zombies all look grotesquely disfigured, but I'll be honest, these super smooth models don't have the same impact as their heavily aliased counterparts in 2 and 3. The added system memory of the DC allows for much larger areas without having to break them up with door transitions. This combined with the sweeping camera makes for a high level of immersion. But sadly, it's not all good news. One thing that really rubbed me the wrong way was the game's fog. Every area is steeped in it, and I never really noticed this my first few encounters with the game, but after upscaling it through the FrameMeister, it's clear that this fog is present in almost every area. I'm gonna have to assume that this was some type of trick to keep the Dreamcast from rendering whole areas at once, but I can't find any info on the matter, so for all I know, this might just be a stylistic choice. Now, this doesn't ruin the look of the game, but it can wash out the picture in some screens. I also noticed that the in-game animations aren't too fluid when compared to parts 2 and 3, but I doubt someone who plays this game on its own would ever even be able to spot such a small gripe. And with all that out of the way, we can jump into what has recently become my favorite part of making these videos, and that's comparing the ports. Code Veronica has a pretty good number of re-releases, and lucky for me, they're all fairly similar. First up is the PS2 port, Code Veronica X. This version actually changes things around a bit more than any of the other ports we've covered so far. There are some added cutscenes and alterations to existing ones, some re-recorded dialogue, a changed intro video, and the absolute weirdest change, Steve's brand new luscious bangs. For years I racked my brain trying to figure out why Capcom would alter something as insignificant as a hairstyle, but apparently this was the result of fans constantly comparing him to Leonardo DiCaprio, which I guess I can kinda see. The PS2 version also boasts some cleaner visuals, well, sort of. Overall, the picture is noticeably sharper, which I'm sure looks way better displayed on an old CRT with a composite connection, but upscaling shows it to be a much more alias picture compared to the Dreamcast's softer look. For you videophiles, the Dreamcast release can push 480p with the right VGA box, but the PS2 is locked to an interlaced output. The weird fog is still present on the PS2, but thanks to a sharper picture, it's way less of an issue, even though it can still wash out colors in some cases. The only downside I can see are some textures looking like they tried to enhance the old muddy ones from previous versions, but I doubt that'll make a difference on anyone's playthrough. I also noticed a weird little quirk with some type of blur applied on this version. Now, I first assumed this had to do with my FrameMeister's deinterlacing, but even after I disabled it, the blur was still there. Not really sure why it exists, but it is interesting. The good news is the GameCube version is a carbon copy of this release, and with the sharper look combined with the added content, you'd figure that'd be my recommendation, but there's a reason you've been looking at Dreamcast footage this whole time. Even though the new additions are nice, the Dreamcast original has always been my go-to choice when starting a new game. Like I said before, I kind of prefer the softer video output of the DC, and the controls just feel right on a Dreamcast controller. Although a dash of nostalgia and the nerdy glee I get from seeing Claire's condition on my VMU might play a role in that as well. But for the first time in the retrospective, I can say any of these ports will give you a great experience, and I could recommend all of them really. Well, maybe not all of them. There was an attempt at giving this classic a new coat of paint in the 2011 PS3 and 360 HD re-release, but despite a massively overhauled lighting engine and some really sharp 2D assets, the overall picture is way too dark to even be considered as a recommendation. Of course, the fact that it's digital only doesn't help either. Alright, so now you know which version of the game you should play, but the question remains, should you even bother playing it? And the answer is a resounding yes. Code Veronica does the tried and true Resident Evil formula an immense justice. The controls, combat, exploration, and puzzle solving are all perfectly transplanted onto this new platform, of course with a few new additions to spice things up. To put things bluntly, this is the Resident Evil fans' Resident Evil. It definitely loses a few points for some awful voice acting and a middle-of-the-road plot, but in the face of a perfect adaptation on different architecture, little things like that kind of fail to register. The longer playtime is definitely appreciated, and the addition of some more playable characters really feels like a return to form for the series. Without any hesitation, I would say Code Veronica deserves a spot right at the top with some of the best entries in the series. Being a new game on a new platform naturally gave the community a bit of doubt, but CV has certainly earned its place on the timeline in my opinion. But sadly, the good news ends there, because Code Veronica was the end of an era, the last in a long line, the only living relative in a dead bloodline. Guys, the honeymoon is officially over now that we have covered, and yes, it pains me to say this, the last traditional survival horror game in the numbered Resident Evil series. Now, I know a lot of you are excited to see my opinions of the next 4 entries in the series, but part of me is a little sad at the end of one journey and the beginning of a new one. Thanks for sticking around for 5 entries in this little project of mine, and I hope to see you next time right here on the Resident Evil Retrospective. Hey guys, thanks for swinging by. This project has been an absolute blast so far, and I'm honestly humbled by how much support you've all given me. I really can't thank you enough. If you're looking to extend this retrospective, maybe think about checking out my Patreon page. I'm halfway to my funding goal, and that means you guys are halfway to seeing every single spin-off the series has to offer covered right here. Well guys, thanks again, and until next time, I'll see you guys later.